Good afternoon. Welcome to Curator's Corner. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us today for a look at the Berlin Tunnel. International Spy Museum Curator of Special Projects, Dr. Alexis Albion, will introduce our speaker and get the conversation going. So, without further ado, I'm going to make a bad joke. I'm ready for the whole truth about the Berlin Tunnel. Over to you, Alexis. Sorry, had to.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you for the funny intro. It is my great pleasure to introduce our guest today. It is Steve Vogel. He is a veteran journalist with over 20 years at the Washington Post. He's covered events from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the first Gulf War, military operations in Somalia, Rwanda, the Balkans, Iraq, as well as the 9/11 attack on the Pentagon. He was a finalist for the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for coverage of the war in Afghanistan, and the author of a number of books, including this one that we're going to be talking about today, Betrayal in Berlin, the true story of the Cold War's most audacious espionage operation. Not to give anything away, it is the Berlin Tunnel. Thank you so much for being here, Steve. It's not the first time you've joined us at the Spy Museum, but this time virtually. Thanks for doing this.
My pleasure.
We're going to get right into talking about the book, but just and the story. But before we do that, I just wanted to ask you quickly, why did you choose this particular topic? I know there's a personal connection, and I thought that might be nice for our listeners and viewers to hear about.
Yeah, I mean, by chance, well, maybe not by chance, but I was born in Berlin. My dad was a case officer with the CIA, and he was there 57 to 62, sort of at the tail end of some of the story. And I was born there in 1960. Just before the wall went up, which my dad later said was no coincidence, but I always felt this connection with Berlin, and was back there as a reporter when the wall came down. So it's definitely a city that holds a lot of interest to me.
And did that help with your research, that you had connections with CIA, connections with friends of your dad? Were any of them involved with this operation?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, very much so. In fact, his immediate boss, Dave Murphy, was very much involved in the project. And then my dad worked for Bill Harvey, who died many years ago. But many of the other people in the Berlin base worked with my dad, and in fact, two of them were my godparents. So,
oh my goodness! Yeah.
Yeah. So
a lot of personal connections.
A lot of personal connections.
And just I'm out of interest in writing the book. Feel like you're getting to know your dad better in any way?
Yeah, very much so, because he died many years ago. So he was still at the agency. I never really had a chance to talk to him about what he did. In fact, I hadn't even known that he would work for the CIA till I was almost in college. So I was just I thought we were just roaming around to Islamabad and Mexico City and places like that, as part of the State Department family. So,
that is always so fascinating, I think, to me and to lots of people. We see that in the movies and on TV, but it's really true. You didn't know what your dad.
No, I didn't, and that is one of the really neat things about the book for me, because I learned so much about what he was doing, the types of missions that he was assigned to, the people he was working with, what his reputation was with his colleagues, and that meant a lot to me.
Well, let's start digging in. I can do puns as well, Amanda. So let's see. I've got to figure out how to get this nice slides up on my screen. I hope this works.
I want you to know I appreciate the pun. Thank you.
You do. Is this working? Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Great.
It looks great.
So I obviously there is a link here with the museum's exhibits directly. We have a piece of the original Berlin Tunnel, a 6-foot section of it in the museum. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. This is a view of it. The museum is open. You can come and see it whenever you want. It's in our gallery where we discuss actually a technical intelligence collection. Here's a beautiful shot. We'll go back to that, but I did want to start with that. You know, before we get into it, here's Steve's book right here, Betrayal in Berlin. I was really struck, Steve, when I received the book. And I looked at the front, and there's this sort of classic shadowy spy figure on the front. And if you've been to the museum, or when you go to the museum, when you come off the elevators, right before you enter our permanent exhibits, we have a huge mural on the wall right in front of you, which is kind of supposed to set the scene, get you in the mood for entering the shadow world. And I couldn't help but put it next to the image on the front of your book. If you take a look, here's the mural that we have on the wall. Doesn't it just look so much like the front of your book here?
Yeah.
I thought that was great. And what it occurred to me is what we were trying to go with this mural was sort of, well, right when you're sort of entering the museum and starting to go into our exhibits, you know, you're going to be learning about sort of classic espionage. And I thought, this is a classic spy story that you're telling us here today. So it really fits in. So give us a little bit of background, because I think it is important to set the context for the tunnel, what it was supposed to be doing, why it was built, and so on. I've got a little history slide here for you.
Sure. Yeah. Well, this is 1950s Berlin, 1950s Germany. So we're talking. Important to remember, we're talking before the Berlin Wall goes up. You have a divided country. You have the Cold War really settling into a reality at this point. And Berlin is the city deep in the eastern zone, where all four powers from World War II control their own zones. And Berlin has become a real center of espionage in those days, because this is one place where we could get sort of behind the Iron Curtain, where the West had a window more or less looking in. So it was a hotbed of espionage activity. There was a very large Soviet force that had remained in Eastern Europe, in particular in East Germany and Poland after the war, and they were pretty much being kept on a war footing. And this was a time when the U.S. and the Western Allies had none of the overhead imagery that we think of, the U-2 or the Corona satellites. So we were basically in this Cold War more or less fighting blind. We had very little in the way of successful agent operations behind the Iron Curtain, in the Stalin police state. The CIA was still a fledgling operation that was totally being outdone by the Soviets. The Soviets had managed to steal some of the Manhattan Project's secrets, exploded their own nuclear weapons, and in 1953 also a hydrogen bomb. And Dwight Eisenhower takes power as U.S. president at a time when the U.S. and the Allies, I think, were uniquely vulnerable. And they needed desperately to get better intelligence, and that is kind of sets the stage for why the Berlin Tunnel becomes important.
Right, and here we've got, as you can see, the different sectors of Berlin, and the idea was to. Do you want to get a little bit into what the purpose of the tunnel was, and where it was going to be located?
The idea was that the Soviet forces were headquartered near Berlin, down in Wunsdorf, and they were using the old telephone system that connected Imperial Germany to Moscow from really the pre-World War I days, and the Soviets were using a lot of those cables. And the CIA base in Berlin was able to recruit agents within the East German telecommunications ministry who were able to provide drawings of circuits, where some of these cables ran. And after a lot of snooping around over several years, they determined that there was a place down in the very southeast corner of the American sector, right in this very pretty rural area of Berlin, where the cables were running below an East German highway that was really only less than a quarter mile from the American sector, and this becomes the area that they're going to target and try to see if they can reach those cables.
Well, let's talk about some of the people, some of the brains behind the whole project, the whole operation. Here are a couple of interesting characters. You mentioned Bill Harvey on the right already, but tell us about Frank Rowlett and how he played a role in all this.
Well, Frank Rowlett was one of the unsung heroes of World War II. He'd been behind a lot of the breaking of the Japanese codes, the purple, for example, and he had had a falling out with the fledgling NSA and had joined Bill Harvey and the CIA and was involved in overseeing some of their technical operations. And they were both frustrated at the lack of communications intelligence they were getting from the Soviets. For a while, during and after World War II, we had been able to intercept a lot of Soviet radio communications and decrypt them, and that operation had been enormously successful, but it was betrayed by KGB spies, including Kim Philby. So all of a sudden, after Black Friday in 1948, everything had gone dark, and the Soviets had largely moved to landlines for their most secure communications. So Rowlett and Harvey begin putting their heads together. Harvey was, an amazing character in espionage history. He was a former FBI G-man who'd had a falling out with J. Edgar Hoover. Just a notorious drinker, a guy who just packed about 6 guns on his side every time he waddled down the hallway. And but he was known as the CIA's top expert on Soviet counterintelligence, and he and Frank Rowlett put their heads together, and then they were also going to borrow some ideas from the British, who would also have a big role in this.
Well, let's talk about the British. Here are a couple of them there. Tell us all about Peter Lunn. Yeah.
Peter Lunn was a very interesting fellow. He has a background as a ski champion. He'd been the captain of the British ski team in the 30s at the 1936 Olympics in Germany, in fact. And he had been recruited into the British Secret Intelligence Service during the war. And after the war, he had been in Vienna, which, like Berlin, was a divided city, and had also provided an opportunity to tap into Soviet lines on a smaller scale than what was envisioned in Berlin. And it was also an easier operation there because a lot of the Soviet lines ran in the western sector. So Lunn masterminded that, and they had shared some of this information with the CIA, and it wasn't at all a surprise that the British were also going to target Berlin. And Lunn was sent to Berlin to take over the SIS station there, and he, with the goal of making their own tunnel or working with the Americans.
Now, it's impossible for us to talk about the Berlin Tunnel without talking about George Blake and his role. In fact, in your book, you start with actually talking about George Blake, right? And his story. He's part of the British team, right? Here's a lovely picture of him. Tell us a little bit more about Blake and the role that he comes to play in all of this.
Yeah, he's a fascinating character. In fact, that photo you have there, that was taken upon his release from captivity from North Korea in 1953.
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah, there he is with his fellow British diplomats who had been held in captivity for close to 3 years. Even before that, Blake's story was remarkable. He was the son of an Egyptian father and a Dutch woman who had met during World War I, and the father gained British citizenship through fighting for the British Army. And by the time Blake was a young boy, he'd lived in Egypt for a time, and then he had become a resistance worker for the Dutch resistance after the Nazis invaded during World War II, and he spent well over a year peddling around Holland, delivering messages and other documents. So he had lived this life of danger. He ends up escaping during the war across Europe, and makes his way eventually to England, where he's recruited into British intelligence and becomes their station chief in South Korea just when the Korean War breaks out, and he's taken prisoner. And during that time, at some point, he makes the decision to switch sides. And when he returns to England in 1953 with his colleagues, no one, of course, in the UK knows this. And Blake is given a very important position.
His allegiances were no longer with the British, right?
That's right. That he had agreed to work for the KGB, and he is given a hero's welcome upon return, and then assigned to a very sensitive position in what was known as Section Y, which was the part of the British intelligence that was going to be overseeing the tunnel operation.
Right. So even on the British side, all the time, oops, we actually have a Soviet mole. So let's get back to the tunnel. Here's Berlin again, and as you've mentioned before, they decided to build it from the American sector into the Soviet sector. I think I've got a little picture of exactly where it went there. And here's the location of the tunnel. Was that why did they choose in that particular area?
Yeah, this is on the American side. This is an area known as Rudau, and it's across from what was really a village of Alglinica in East Germany. And the main reason for this location was the proximity. The three targeted cables that the CIA had determined were carrying a huge volume of Soviet Red Army communications strayed pretty close to the border, to the sector border in that area. There were some other places they looked at, one in the British sector, but that was right in the heart of downtown Berlin, and it was thought to be too difficult to try to build a secret tunnel in that area. So logistically, this turned out to be the best section. And the next problem was to figure out how they're going to disguise a tunneling operation. The British and the Americans decide pretty quickly early on that they're going to work together on this, because it's going to be a very technically difficult operation, very expensive operation. The Brits didn't have a ton of money, coming out of World War II, and the Americans were flush. But the British had the real technical expertise that was going to be required for placing taps on this scale, based on their experience in Vienna and elsewhere. So
I've read that it was about just under $7 million, the cost of building the tunnel. Does that sound about right?
That would probably be on the low side. I think it depends on what is included. There were so many support operations that had to be set up to support this whole thing, that the cost was probably considerably more. Maybe a factor of 5 or 6 times more than that, but I don't think we'll ever have a precise figure. But it cost a lot. You could certainly, particularly in dollars for 1955.
So let's take a look at what some of the ideas they came up with for building and disguising the building of the tunnel. Here again is you can see that little dotted line there on the right. That's the tunnel. But what about this incredibly large structure here, which I'm calling the warehouse? What was the purpose of that?
Yeah, so this was farmland, and the Americans went in and quickly leased a big chunk of farmland there, and they came up with this idea that they were going to the U.S. Army, which of course was spread out around West Berlin in the American sector, was going to put a warehouse there, which, wasn't that unusual. There was a lot of U.S. Army installations, large American presence there. And this installation was going to be, supposedly to warehouse American goods in the event of another Soviet blockade. This was, a few years after the Berlin airlift. That was, one theory as to why the Americans would need a warehouse there. So the idea was, they're trying to figure how we're going to build a tunnel and then cart away all this soil that we're going to have to dig out, just thousands of tons of soil. And they came up with the idea, well, we'll build this warehouse and we'll just store the dirt in the warehouse. And, and that became the operating principle. So, and as the idea developed, they decided, well, we're going to need another excuse for this building to be here. So they decided to put radar dishes on it. And it was going to be a radar installation monitoring Soviet activity at the nearby Schönefeld airfield, which was used by the Soviet Air Force. So that was a natural. And that it becomes the secret facility, but the real secret was under the ground.
Here's another another view of that warehouse, the area there. And I love this picture here. Here we've got a couple of East German police actually taking a look.
Yeah,
there must have been some suspicions about what was going on at the time.
Oh, I mean, they had their glasses trained on this strange building all the time. Particularly, once they started putting up these weird antenna and dishes up on the top, and the Americans had observers inside the building looking back at the East Germans. It always cracked them up because the Vopo's glasses were focused towards the roof of the building and never directly below their feet. So the digging, which is underway, has to be done very quietly. And anytime any of the East German guards are overhead, the observers give a signal for the digging down below to cease. So this is a sort of a cat and mouse game that's going on for quite a while.
Here are some of the characters who are actually involved in the whole engineering project. It's nice, for us to know about the people who are actually on the ground working all this out. Sometimes we don't hear about those people, but tell us about them, and I'd be really interested to know, when you were doing your research, how you got in touch with these people and their relatives and found out more about their stories.
Yeah, I was really lucky to find some of these gentlemen. I tracked down Bob Williamson early on, and we spoke. And unfortunately, he passed away not long after that. But his son was able to assemble a number of papers that his father had kept from the project, and it included some of the names of other people involved, including Captain Keith Comstock, who was another one of this trio of captains that were assembled. This is kind of like an Ocean's 11 type thing, where Bob Williamson was given, was told that we have a secret assignment for you, except we can't tell you what you're going to do. It's going to involve a tunnel, and it needs to be done in secret, and you need to put together a team. And he just traveled around, just trying to find people with secret clearances who could be part of this team. And they're sent out.
He didn't even know where he was being sent either.
No, they had no idea. They would be in Berlin, and they practiced out in the desert, New Mexico, out near Sandia, and in terrain that would be somewhat similar to what they have in Berlin. But they did this in secret with the equipment that was built under classified contracts, and it wasn't until they finally packed up all their gear and put it on a train to Virginia for shipment over to Europe that they finally learned that they were going to be going to Berlin. So it was a very mysterious operation for the entire Corps of Engineers team. And there's also, at the same time, the Royal Engineers, the British are also
Right.
assembling a team that are going to be involved in another part of the excavation when they need to do the tap. So the British are
Right.
secretly
So they
at
sort
the
of
same time.
split up they kind of split up the operation, right,
That's
that
right.
way between the British, the taskings for the British engineers and the tasks for the American engineers.
That's right. Exactly.
Were you able to get in touch with anybody on the British side, the engineering team there?
Well, the gentleman who was incredibly helpful was Peter Montagnon. Now he was an SIS officer, communications guy, and he was down below with the Royal Engineers and also their post office tappers. The guys who actually did the tap came from the General Post Office. So he was sort of down there below below the East German Highway with the team as the whole tapping operation went along. And I also heard was in contact with some of the relatives of other men who were involved with the project, who were very helpful, supplied photographs and so forth. So, but Peter was a wonderful fellow. He would later work for the BBC. He produced the entire BBC Civilization series with Sir Kenneth Clarke, and he had marvelous tales about what it was like down there. And one recollection was that it really smelled when they're they're down there in this airtight compartment trying to do these taps, and they actually had to stop at certain times because of the sweat, the humidity that was rising inside the chamber. It was feared that it would create a short and just blow the entire operation. So
Now there is a story about when they were digging and they actually they were digging down and there was a cesspool. Isn't that correct? Is that right? That was there and started flooding into the tunnel area.
It was really more of a septic field that had been constructed for the warehouse, and they had the American engineers had just broken ground and gone through the floor of the warehouse and were heading out. They ran into water, which was unexpected, but it turned out they had some clay in the soil there that was holding up water that they had to figure out how to get around. It really forced them to dig the tunnel at a much higher, closer to the surface than they had wanted to do. And then they run into the septic field, and it's just horribly unpleasant, to put it mildly. They had to work through that, but they persevered, and Bill Harvey and the people overseeing the project were there to encourage them to move ahead. But these guys overcame a lot of obstacles, and they were digging 24 hours a day. The tunnel, I think you might have a photograph showing that. This is just a here we go, the 6-foot diameter. So it's pretty close quarters. They can't use any mechanical equipment because that would create noise. So they're hand digging it with just little entrenching tools, these army shovels, with a 6-foot face of the tunnel there, so they can have about 3 people up front, and they're putting the soil into sandbags, and they constructed this little makeshift electric railroad, pulled by a forklift to haul the soil back to the warehouse. And it's quite an operation, and it's hot down there, and they're going about maybe 10 feet a day, and they've got a good quarter mile to go. So it's a 24 hours a day operation.
It's worth, I think just looking at a few of the statistics there. So they're about 9 feet below ground. Is that right?
It ended up being at about
around 9 feet below ground. It's about 1,500 feet long. So that's more than 4 soccer fields or 9 Olympic-sized swimming pools.
Or taller than the Empire State Building, which kind of gives you a sense of how far they had to dig.
And there's 3,000 tons of dirt being excavated out of there, and the whole thing took them less than 6 months.
Right. They got 1 week of R&R down in Bavaria, where they just drank and slept. But But yeah, it was around the clock. Then they finished in February of 1955, and the Americans were just basically, hauled out. The Corps of Engineers guys, they had no idea what would happen next. They didn't even know that the British team was standing at the ready at the British airfield to take over the operation. So they're moved out, and then the British are moved in, and they take over the next phase of the operation to basically to construct the tap.
Well, before we get there, this is a great photograph here. What's going on below ground? Here's a photograph of what's going on above ground, right?
Yeah. So this is this is a farmer's field. This is the East German farmer Paul Noack, who was busy planting an orchard and potato fields on this ground. This is kind of a dream he'd had of setting up his family farm on this ground. So he's plowing, and every now and then I spoke to his daughter, who was very helpful, and every now and then he would hear like a whining noise. It might have been the pumps they were using to get rid of the septic or the water and all that. And he figured it was coming from the warehouse. And the other thing he noticed was that some of his trees were dying. There's something wrong with the ground, so he had to replant those. But he's working away above ground, and they're working away below the ground, and never the twain met.
It's extraordinary. So you mentioned the next phase of the operation. I think a couple of photographs here. So after the tunnel is built, obviously they have to do some installation in there. What are we seeing in these images?
Right. Well, on the left, that's a good image. You can see the little wooden rail line that they have there that they use to haul things out. They've also stored sandbags on both sides. Most of the sandbags went out to the warehouse, but they also used it to line both sides of the tunnel, which was good for insulating noise, keep things from being too hollow and noisy above ground, and also to provide sort of shelves on which they could run all the cables, air conditioning ducts, all kinds of equipment that was going to have to run down the length of this tunnel. Down to this end on the right, what we're seeing there is the equipment chamber, or preamplifier chamber that the British team put together. And this was directly below the East German highway. So they're right below the road there. It's very close to where the tap cables are. And the reason they needed all this equipment there was because the tap that they were going to have to put into these cables was going to have to be so delicate, and the charge that was being taken off the cables was so low that it was going to have to be amplified immediately, or they would never make it back to the warehouse in a way that they could understand what was being said. So all this equipment looked
Let's
like
have a look at it.
Yeah.
Here's
right.
Another view of the section, and as you can see, there's the line between the U.S. and Soviet sector. You can see how the majority of it's obviously going into the Soviet sector. And then on the right-hand side there, we just saw an image of that preamp chamber there that you spoke of, and this is where the tap is located over there. In fact, we've got an image of some of the taps. And then on the other side, it's traveling down and going to the warehouse, and there's the tap and the take.
That's right. Yeah, it was. Well, the tap itself. This was done in May of 1955. First they had to create the amp chamber, and also then a sort of a tap chamber, which they had to reach by this marvelous British device they called the mole, which looked like the cross between a Venetian blind and a charcoal grill. And they had to carefully scrape this very loose soil, over their heads in order to reach the cables without having everything cave in on them, because this is very sandy soil, and the cables themselves are only 27 inches below the surface. So it's remarkably a delicate operation. And then they have to get into those 3 trunk cables, which are each carrying hundreds of circuits, and they've created some branch lines that you could see coming out of those 3 cables. That's heading back to the preamp chamber, and then from there on back to the warehouse. So this happens one night in May. You had some of the Americans and British processors are back in the warehouse, listening anxiously as this tapping operation goes on. They're doing it in the middle of the night when there's less chance of the work being detected. And back in the warehouse, the guys are listening, and they can all of a sudden they hear a Soviet Army colonel, talking to one of his colleagues, and they were in, and very quickly they are almost inundated by the amount of communications that are coming in, because each one of these 3 cables is carrying hundreds of conversations, teletyped or voice communications, and they've got 150 of these Ampex recorders back in the warehouse, just in this big U shape, and they're all spinning at the same time. And these guys are like a bunch of wildcatters out in Texas who are just drowning in the oil. They've hit it big, but they're drowning in the tape, because there was a lot.
I've got, let's see, about 5,000 reels of tape that were sent to London and to Washington for analysis. 40,000 hours of telephone conversations that were recorded, 368,000 Soviet conversations recorded. The take is enormous, and the tunnel was in operation for about a year.
Right. I mean, they had the guys in the warehouse were just a sort of a forward processing team, half dozen folks or so, plus support personnel. But what's happening is that these tapes are being flown back almost every day to either London. The voice tapes are going to London, and the teletype is going to Washington. In Washington, there's a processing center set up pretty close to the Lincoln Memorial, one of these temporary buildings, that used to scar the mall down there. And this place was practically collapsing under the weight of all the tapes that were arriving on a daily basis. And they had, large numbers of translators, transcribers, analysts going through this material. None of them are told that this is coming from a tunnel, but slowly some of them are able to piece that together. Meanwhile, in London, the British are going through all the voice tapes there. They're having to, call in all kinds of retired British colonels from the Boer Wars who can help translate the Russian, and of course some of it's in German as well. So it's quite a bit of material, but and some of it is high value targets. The commander of Soviet forces in Germany, General Grechko. But a lot of it is just like the logistic clerks, the guys at some far-flung depot somewhere talking to a counterpart at another installation, and that's where a lot of information is being collected, because these guys are the ones where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. They're the ones that are keeping track of the movement of materiel, and any sort of indication of an invasion is probably going to come from the information from logistical clerks such as those. But it's all coming in.
And you told me that, as I recall, one of the issues was being kind of up to date with sort of the language of the time, and especially curse words.
Yeah. Yeah, the Soviets were prodigious profanity users, and even some of these our best translators on both sides had never heard some of these words before, so they had to the British in particular were making use of a lot of Russian emigres who had fled the Soviet Union after the Bolshevik revolution, and were living in London, and a lot of these guys were brought in and to help translate particularly a lot of the curse words. But it was they had to have a glossary of all the the special Soviet curse words that were used on a regular basis.
So the tunnel is in operation. They're picking up incredible intelligence, sending it back. It's being analyzed and used. And then April 1956, this happens.
Yeah, you know, they're monitoring the Americans and the British are the whole time. You know, the teams, the Soviet technicians who would monitoring these lines. So if they're watching for any clues that the Soviets or East Germans are onto it, and they haven't detected anything. But then in April of 56, there's a very heavy rain for several days, and a lot of short circuits start developing across the lines all around Berlin. And lo and behold, you know, a Soviet army team is set out to try to find a break in the lines pretty close to where the tunnel is located. And one night, as you know, the team in the warehouse is watching, the Soviets begin digging over the tunnel, and you know, very soon the whole thing is being exposed to the world.
These are a bunch of photographs that were taken with the discovery. It was these were in the newspaper, right? It was just a huge PR coup for the Soviets and the East Germans, obviously.
Right.
Here's a few images. The press was brought in. Tourists were allowed, well, people were allowed to come and take a look at the tunnel. I've got some more images here. I know this one on the left is one of your favorites.
That's right. That's you're now entering the American sector. But yeah, this was a big surprise to the Americans and the Brits. They had assumed that you know, the Soviets would want to keep this quiet, you know, because they'd be embarrassed to show that they had been, you know, tapped into by the Americans. But instead, the Soviets made a big propaganda display of it, and the idea was they wanted to use this to force the Americans and the Allies out of West Berlin. That, you know, to justify their claim that you know, this was being used as a nest of spies. That the Western Allies were only using Berlin to, you know, to dig into East German territory, and, you know, all this shameful espionage and so on and so forth. Yeah, it becomes like the biggest tourist draw in Berlin for a while. It was quite a spectacle. People were selling, you know, bratwurst and you know, beers outside, and you know, people were getting all kinds of souvenirs. It was a big draw.
So I want to move us along and give some time for questions, but there are a couple of other important things we have to cover. So number one, whatever happened to that Soviet mole who had exposed everything? Because the question is that the Soviets exposed the tunnel. Oh my goodness, they discovered it, but of course they had known about it all along, right?
Yeah, they'd had quite a good read on what was happening from George Blake. In fact, before, you know, the first shovelful of soil is dug, the KGB was aware of this plan. And what's remarkable, though, really is what they did and didn't do. The information from Blake, which he gives to his handler, Sergei Kondrashov, in January of 1954, is deemed so sensitive that essentially it is kept in a very small circle of maybe 3 or 4 people at the KGB, including Ivan Serov, the chief of the KGB. And the concern was that the tunnel was such a close hold operation, and George Blake was one of, you know, just a handful of Western intelligence officers who knew anything about it, that if they did anything to shut down the tunnel, Blake would immediately come under suspicion. So, you know, the order comes from the top that the KGB not only does not tell the Red Army about this project, they don't even tell initially the KGB residents in Berlin. So the KGB officers operating in Berlin don't know about this operation that's getting underway, and that continues.
Right. So I think we'll talk about that a bit later in some questions. But George Blake is such an interesting character, and his story keeps going, right? The tunnel is exposed, but Blake isn't exposed quite yet. It takes a few more years.
Right. I interviewed him, and yeah, he was very fearful when the tunnel was discovered. He'd been tipped off that the tunnel discovery was going to be coming, and he was, just kept a very low profile, worried that he would be exposed. Over the time he was in Berlin now for several years, he had been just this one-way tunnel of turning over British intelligence secrets to the KGB. He'd been extremely effective. He'd been proving himself to be really the most effective spy that the Soviets had at that time. And he's able to continue his operations for several more years until the defection of a Polish intelligence officer brings about Blake's discovery and his arrest in 1961.
Right, he's arrested, he's put on trial, and he's thrown into prison. This formidable looking building over here, Wormwood Scrubs, and something incredible happens. He manages to escape.
Yeah, 1966, and this was something that Blake pretty much orchestrated himself with the help of other prisoners on the inside and others who had been released. The KGB, had looked into seeing if they could spring him, but they decided it wasn't going to be possible. But Blake had a good way of converting people to his side, and he was able to convince some of his fellow prisoners to help on this, one of the most remarkable prison escapes of the 20th century. And
he defects to the Soviet Union. Here's Blake with another famous defector, Kim Philby, having a final time in Moscow. And here's Blake, I think this was his 90th birthday, is that correct?
That's right. He had been, Putin himself had awarded Blake with another medal. So it was a big day. They celebrate his birthday every year. He's quite a hero in Russia.
And so as far as we know, he's still alive and relatively well, living in Moscow.
No, he lives outside of Moscow, but yeah, he's blind at this point largely. His health is not great, but he's holding on.
So the other great mystery is, of course, whatever happened to the Berlin Tunnel. Here's a piece of it, relatively recently, rusting away. Tell us what happened to the tunnel.
Well, on the eastern side, all of the East Germans, after using it as a tourist attraction for 6 or 8 months, the East German army dug it all up, and it was thought that it had been melted down, and nobody really knew what had happened to it. On the western side, this was a piece that was discovered when they were building an Autobahn over the tunnel site, and that's one of the pieces that the Allied Museum in Berlin, which has a big tunnel display and was a great source of information about the tunnel. But then it was discovered later that there were some more pieces. Some of those East German pieces actually had not been melted down, and the East German army had ended up distributing them all through East Germany to be used by East German army engineering units as for training, storage, various different purposes. Yeah,
right,
so
and one of the beneficiaries of that has been the International Spy Museum. We managed to get a piece of the tunnel. Here it is, actually, arriving in Washington and being installed in our museum, where you can come and see it today. It's a wonderful piece of history. As I said, we just have a 6-foot portion of it, but we're very happy to have it. It's a fantastic story. I'm gonna just wrap things up right now and open it up to some questions. Anybody has anything at all to ask Steve about the Berlin Tunnel? Go for
They
it.
definitely do. They are pouring in. And first of all, a variety of people want to know, was the communications totally compromised? Did this end up being a deception operation by the Soviets because they knew about the attack?
Right. Well, this was something that a lot of people assumed. Once Blake escaped and made it to Russia, and he revealed in an interview with Izvestia that he'd blown the tunnel before it was even constructed. This became the common belief that, well, of course, then all this information was a joke. This was this was all disinformation. That they wouldn't have put any real information out if they'd known that the lines were being tapped. The Americans were made fools of once again, and this was kind of the common interpretation for many years afterwards. But with the end of the Cold War, and with some of the secrets that were coming out at that point, and also a book that Sergei Kondrashov, who was Blake's handler, wrote with Dave Murphy, CIA officer, it became what emerges is that the KGB, in the first place, they weren't very worried about the information on those lines because most of them belonged to the Red Army. So you have the classic sort of hey, it's not our lines, it's the Red Army's problem. That was part of the thought process. Another part of it was that they didn't know how much information the Americans and the British were going to be able to collect and process. That so much was being transmitted on these lines. So the KGB itself was actually also had some of its calls being intercepted on these lines, because while the most important KGB traffic with Moscow went back over special guarded lines overhead, there were other calls that were coming into the KGB headquarters from stations around Germany that were being intercepted, so which the Soviets didn't realize. So all in all, there was a lot of information that was coming in. Now then, the Soviets were presented with the possibility of planning disinformation, and that's what a lot of people have assumed has happened. Well, it must have been bad information, but it's logistically impossible. When you think of the thousands of calls that were being intercepted, these were the main lines being used by the entire Soviet Red Army in Germany. If they wanted to start planning disinformation, it would have been immediately contradicted by the flow of actual information. So even if you put some bad information in, it would have stuck out like a red flag, a sore thumb for the analyst looking at it. And if they started trying to, tell people who were using those lines, hey, give bad information, or don't use those lines, the Americans and their their agents in the East German ministry were monitoring who was using those lines. So if they started diverting traffic off those lines, or if bad information is coming out of those lines, that would have stuck out too. So in the end, and this is quite clear from what Blake has said, and what all participants on all sides believe, is that it was basically impossible for the Soviets to plant disinformation. Possibly there was a little bit here and there, but the vast majority of 90,000 plus conversations that were intercepted have to be real.
Cool. This is a great, very background-oriented question. Understanding the tunnel was built to obtain communication, but this was before the Berlin Wall went up. Why couldn't people just cross back and forth?
Well, they were. Yeah, and then there was a lot. That's why Berlin was such a hotbed of espionage, so that you had people every day, and that's why the CIA base in Berlin was so large and important, because they were recruiting a ton of information. So they were having great successes in Berlin in the 1950s. But the information that the tunnel was getting was specifically, the Red Army. So they're intercepting conversations between Grechko and subordinates. They're also getting intel going back and forth with Moscow, and they get some of the first information about Khrushchev's secret speech denouncing Stalin in 1956. That comes from some of these tunnel intercepts. So they're looking essentially for information. The key thing that Eisenhower wanted, that the U.S. and Churchill, who was again prime minister, wanted, was any hint that the Soviets were planning a surprise attack. That was the main worry. And the tunnel intercepts for almost a year were able to assure Eisenhower and the rest of the Western Command that this was not in the works. They could rest a little bit easier.
And it's almost, it's lack of intelligence. It's almost the fact that they didn't find any intelligence that indicated that, right? It was one of those things where lack of intelligence was incredibly important intelligence.
Yeah, it was the dog that didn't bark. I mean, it was a huge relief to Eisenhower, because he's writing in his diary at this time. We just dedicated a memorial to Eisenhower yesterday, and going through his diaries, he's staying up at night thinking he's going to have to launch a preemptive strike against the Soviets, because they have hydrogen capability, increased missile and bomber capabilities, and so the tunnel is a huge relief for him.
And to go back to our speaker's question, we rely on so many different types of intelligence. It's never just, even if you can cross and do human intelligence, you want signals intelligence and communications intelligence. So another, another arrow in the quiver or something like that. So
exactly.
People want to know, how did the tunnel diggers know exactly where the Soviet cables were, and also why did the British have more expertise in tunnel digging?
Well, the British expertise was more in tapping. So the Americans were the tunnel diggers. I mean, the Corps of Engineers was given that part of the job, but the British always bring a certain finesse that maybe the Americans were lacking at that time. So they had their team from the General Post Office, a special secret unit within the post office that had experience from World War II, had worked with Montgomery's army, and then also in Vienna with the tapping operation down there. So, some of these fellows simply had experience that the American CIA certainly didn't have. They didn't have people with the experience and expertise to, because these circuits, these cables that they're tapping into, this isn't one phone line of one guy, talking to another guy. These are circuits holding, hundreds of cable circuits within it. So, each one of these cables has to be very gingerly undone and cut into, and then tapped into a corresponding line. So this is very painstaking work that the British were much more capable of doing than the Americans. And I'm sorry, the first part of the question was, you were asking.
They wanted to know about how they knew specifically where the line was, and then why the British. Those were the two parts, and
right.
why the.
So yeah, that was the intelligence that had come from with the CIA's penetration of the East German ministry. They had this little old lady who wore sneakers, who they call her the numbers lady, the Nummermädchen, and she had all the little boxes with index cards that showed which cables were carrying whose traffic, and she was delivering this to the Americans. They had other guys in the ministry who were also delivering important information. And one guy who brought over all the maps showing where these circuits were running. So they had very, very precise information of where these cables were, who was using them, and where they could best be reached. So that certainly helped. But then the Corps of Engineers, though, when they're digging, they have to, they didn't have like GPS or, and they can't even like plot a line above ground. They're having to do this below ground. So it was very difficult effort to try to determine how far to dig. And they ended up, they try hitting baseballs out into the field so they could, triangulate the distance. They ended up having like a van break down on the highway right above where the cables were, so they could use their equipment from the warehouse to measure, how far to go. So it was a complicated operation.
Lots of interest in George Blake. Why do you think he did it? Why did he get such fanfare when he went back to the Soviet Union? Because other defectors, or when he went to the Soviet Union, others did not. And what would have happened if he'd gone back to England? So lots of George Blake interest.
Yeah, well, yeah, and rightly so. He's a pretty fascinating character. But yeah, Blake's motivations. I think there's a pretty wide agreement, even among the the British prosecutors, judge, former colleagues, that he was ideologically motivated. In other words, he wasn't doing it for money. And Blake himself describes, and I talk about this in the book, his experiences in Korea, where he witnessed over 3 years the massive bombing of North Korea, which actually more bomb tonnage is dropped on North Korea than in Germany over the entire of World War II. That was part of it. Part of it, his youth was very, he grew up with a family that was very cosmopolitan, international. Some family members in Egypt. Some of his family members in Egypt, where he spent a couple of years, one of them became like the founder of the Egyptian Communist Party. So he kind of had these thoughts in his head. He was someone who he would say identified with the dispossessed of the world. And the other thing is, I think Blake enjoyed the power that comes with being the spy, the man who's pulling the strings, the man who knows things. I think there was kind of and even though he comes off as mild-mannered and self-effacing, I think part of it is this. There was like an ego thing where he wanted to be the guy who was secretly controlling world events. I think that was part of it as well. So yeah, Blake, why was he welcomed in Russia? Well, I mean, he was.
He deserved it.
Yeah, from Russia's perspective, the Soviet perspective, he'd done quite a bit. And I mean, Kim Philby and the others also, to some extent, were given big welcomes, but they abused it in one way or another. And with the others drank very heavily, and that was the cause of some of the problems that they experienced. Blake has continued to cooperate with the KGB, for years after arriving there. He actually thought after the Cold War ended that maybe he could go back to England. He still had his sons. He had 3 sons that he left behind there. And his mother was in the Netherlands, and he actually thought, well, now everything's forgiven. And he soon learned that everything was not forgiven, and so he was not able to come back. But his sons have been able to visit him in Russia.
Well, we have a comment from our dear friend in Berlin, Bernd von Kaska, who wants to say, hi, Bernd. He wants to say that it's no accident that the tunnel was discovered during Khrushchev's first state visit to Great Britain. And
exactly.
So he was there for the Suez Crisis, so there was an added global dimension to discovering the tunnel at that moment. So
yeah, that's exactly right, and that's like an important chapter in the book that describes what was going on in the world stage there. And Khrushchev, who had been informed about the tunnel, was looking for a propaganda club that he could hold over the West, and that timing the discovery for his first visit to Britain was useful in that way. It's sort of like, in Khrushchev's mind anyway, it drew sympathy to the Soviet side, that, oh, look, the mean Americans are spying on the Soviets. Maybe the Soviets aren't the bad guys. That sort of thing. That's what the hope is in exposing the tunnel in that way. So very good point, Bernd.
All right, last question. Very interesting. Just someone wondering if once it was open as a supply base, did they go through the motions of, acting like this was a supply depot, the Americans?
No, the warehouse supply thing was dropped fairly early on, in favor of using it as a radar installation. And the interesting thing is, well, people would later assume, well, that it was just, those were fake dishes up there. It actually became one of the most productive radar stations for the U.S. Army in Europe in terms because it was intercepting a lot of flight data coming from the Schönefeld airfield. So even after the tunnel was discovered, it continued operating. I talked to some of the guys who worked with the ASA and manned the stations there for quite a while. For several years afterwards, it was delivering useful information for the Army and Air Force in monitoring the Soviets.
May I ask one question? Sorry,
Sure.
just occurred to me.
I was just going to say that was a nice ending for that bill.
Well, maybe this will be a nice ending too. Steve, do any of the tapes, the recordings still exist?
That's a great question. There's some transcripts that the CIA has a collection of documents that was released some years ago behind the front lines, which has particularly transcripts of the conversations when the tunnel was discovered. There's also a lot of reports that are generated from the tapes themselves. These, generally what happens was that the CIA was producing reports based on these tapes. Now, as far as the tapes themselves, the guess is that they don't exist anymore. I mean, nobody I've talked to has been able to establish that they exist. I can't say with any certainty whether they exist or not. And it's possible that there's some warehouse, somewhere in Virginia that maybe has them. But
that's what I was wondering. And how great would it be to listen to that, just to see what it sounded like, what these people were listening to? That would be fantastic.
It would, but after 90,000 hours, you'd probably be driven insane.
Yeah, but this would have been the time to listen. Yeah. Thank you so much, Steve and Alexis. This was so interesting. It's so great to learn so much more about one of our larger artifacts in the collection and all the background. It's really, really amazing. So thank you so much. I hope the wonderful people who join, I hope you will buy this book. We have dropped links into the chat. If you visit our museum to see the tunnel in real life, you can buy that in our store. And I hope you might also consider contributing to the Spy Museum. All of our programs for adults are free, and we have this wonderful matching challenge between now and the end of the year. Anything you donate will double, which is so incredibly amazing, up to $1 million. So please do that. Check out our website for all the cool programs we have for adults, for kids. We do wonderful private programs for seniors. And next week, we have a really interesting program on Wednesday at noon on the 23rd about intelligence challenges in an election year. It's like briefing whether you have an incoming candidate or an incumbent, and how do you get them ready for the challenges of the new administration. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Really appreciate it. And Steve, they want to know, is that a new cabin or a restoration of an old cabin?
It's an old cabin, but it's been restored over the years. But yeah, it's like this cabin was on this site 200 years ago. My neighbor, who's like, great with restoring cabins, restored it about 10 or 15 years ago.
Well, we've been admiring it very much, and people wanted to know. So thanks for sharing that personal bit of info, and everyone take care, stay well, and we'll see. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.